Welcome to our podcast. I'm Karen Avari.
And I am Nuala Gage. Together, we are the safety collaborators and co-founders of Safety Collaborations.
So we help people change the way they think about safety. In fact, we are passionate about it.
And we do this by engaging in dialogue and testing the levels of trust and psychological safety, which are core to organisational culture.
Making safety part of your DNA so that your people speak up, show up, do right, and become safer every day for yourself, your team, and your business.
Our free podcasts intend to share nuggets of wisdom that will challenge your perspectives, potentially solve a nagging problem, share actions that you can implement, and give you at least one aha moment.
We come with many years of experience in delivering safety culture change programs across the globe for high-hazard industries. Join us weekly and let's change the way people think about safety together. Now, let's get on with the show.
Today we continue the conversation with the final episode in our three-part series. In the last episode, we explored how formal and informal decisions are made. Who is more responsible for accuracy and understanding? Non-verbal communication, how status may impact how we respond in social settings, and how we respond individually in a cultural way that makes sense to the other person. It's not easy, but it's certainly worthwhile. Now, let's continue the conversation with a hot potato question.
And which leads, I guess, into another question, which is, so are people willing to take risks to achieve personal goals, or do they prefer to do things the way they have always been done?
That's a hot potato.
And again, when we look at this question, we've got to look at these questions from the perspective, there's a polarity on all of this. There will be times when we are willing to take a risk to achieve a personal goal. And there'll be other times when it'll feel safer to do it the way I've always done it. The challenge that we have when we're in the workplace that we work in high hazard industries is, what is the risk assessment in that? What's the litmus test, if you like, that we need to measure this against? Some of us we know are naturally more risk. What's the word? Not adverse. Some are more risk adverse, and others are more like, woohoo, let's do it. But that doesn't mean they're unsafe necessarily. In fact, could be quite the opposite, actually, because just standing still for too long, something eventually will fall on your head. I was thinking bird droppings, but you can put whatever you like. I'm
picturing a bird dropping. No, but it is true. It absolutely is.
So again, we need to look at, how do we accomplish tasks? How do we get things done? And in what way?
And so, are people, and I'm going to bring it back to that inclusion. That seems to be my passionate comeback today.
Well, it's a big piece in all of this. If we don't step into it, we don't go any further. We just don't.
Exactly. And often speaking up when we know that something isn't the way it should be, or it could be done differently, or there's just that inkling, is a massive risk. So the willingness to take risks to achieve personal goals, as in getting the job done right the first time by stopping somebody from doing it wrong, can sometimes be so fearful, because I don't want to be ostracized for being the person who delayed the process. So I will let people do it the way that they've always done it. And I will stand on the side, even though I know there's a better way of doing this, but the risk is just too great because I don't want to be excluded.
Yeah. Part of the culture acquisition process, or cultural understanding, cultural diversity, understanding, and diversity, equity, and inclusion are three very key points in the cultural space, and setting that, I think I mentioned it earlier, how do we build that, the third cultural view, if you like, within an organisation. is understanding those differences, and that we need the litmus test that we look at, and this will come in a little bit later with another question in a minute, is how do we make people feel, honor their innocence? How do we honor them? And how do we provide power? So it's not empower, but actually give power. And it's quite different.
It's very different. And that's possibly an entire conversation all on its own.
Or we will get to that one, I think, when we talk about the 3 colours of worldview, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's part of the process, is understanding that. So, so are people concerned about doing things on time, or is the schedule organised loosely around situations, circumstances, or matters of convenience? And again, with all of these questions, you'll notice that they're not leaning towards one way or another. It's actually saying that there is this polarity, and it's about what's right at what moment in time. And how do we honour and legitimise the people that are actually doing the work in that moment? And they may have a different view. For some people, it's very much on time. Yeah. Get into the box. As I would say, get into who's going to be early to the grave and who's not.
Yeah.
Pardon that pun in this conversation. But anyway, yeah. So your thoughts?
Well, for me, it also comes back to the whole understanding around people's perceptions of time and the pressure that time and on time and scheduling does. And a few years ago, I was working with a colleague on a site. And as we know in our industry, in production, when things are being built and there are time delays, it costs a lot of money and it causes a lot of penalties for companies. And on this particular site, they were putting together modules to then be completed. And they were running behind. And when we got on to site and we did a walkabout, and it was the biggest site I've ever been on, they had a number of days left, as in a physical number, on each of the modules. My colleague and I were both like, what is that? Because it's not the same number of days on each module. Each module's got its own little thing. And the next day when we went back on site, it had all changed by a day. And then we were very intrigued, and we had a little conversation with the operations team. And what they were doing is that they were letting each work team know how many days they had until that module had to be completed and shipped out. The problem was the delays were not within their circle of influence or control. They couldn't impact whether the materials were going to arrive on time that they needed, whether the contractors were available at the time that was needed. But what they were doing was being put under the most incredible amount of pressure and unnecessary pressure because they couldn't control it. And the number of incidents was increasing. The unintended consequence was far greater than the initial kind of like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's share with people how long we've got to get this done. Because there was no malice meant in putting that up. But the unintended consequence was shocking. Needless to say, the two of us had a very interesting conversation with the people who needed to know, and they did not last very much longer, those little signs on each of those. But we often do things where we don't realize the impact. And time is a big one because we all feel time pressure. We're all, to a greater or a lesser degree, concerned around time. And as a leader, you may walk into a room and look at your colleague and say, how long did you say you're going to be busy with that? Whether it's a report, whether it's finishing a piece of engineering equipment, whatever the case may be. And as they say to you, I'm going to be X amount of time, you look at your watch and you turn around and you walk away. Now, you may very well be looking at your watch to say, okay, if they're going to be another 2 hours, I've got time to do X, Y, Z. The unintended consequence is that as you are walking away, they're going, oh my gosh, 2 hours is obviously far too long. I've got to rush the job. I've got to get it done faster. And that's where things go wrong. So the orientation to time and concern around doing things on time can have, for me, from what I've seen and experienced, some quite harsh responses that we would never have intended.
Absolutely. Time is one of the greatest adjusters of our behaviors. And even the least risk averse, the most risk averse person will be altered by time.
And it's our perception. We do it to ourselves all the time. I mean, I'll share with you
5 minutes late for a meeting in a car drive. Do you tell them that you're going to be late? No, you get into the car and you hope that by some miracle that you'll actually catch up the time. How am I going to catch up the time on that 20-minute drive? Well, I'm probably going to do some behaviors that I shouldn't be doing. I might be going a little bit too fast. I might try to overtake when I shouldn't. I might actually get a bit antsy behind the wheel and be rude, even though, fortunately, the person in front of me can't hear me. Thank goodness. Yeah. So there's all these things that happen all the time to us, you know.
Absolutely. And so a little personal example, I grew up in a family that, you know, being on time for something really wasn't the highest priority in the world, you know. Better to arrive looking good than be on time.
That's it.
So at one of our cousins' weddings, the invitation was for half an hour earlier than what everybody else's was, because they knew that the likelihood of us arriving on time was very limited. So do we manage that? You know, do we manage the people around us? Do we help have that conversation? And it took me a very long time into my adult working career to really embrace the respect of the cultures that I work in. That, you know what, picking up the phone and saying, oh my gosh, I'm on Chaplin's Peak Drive and the whales are amazing. I'm going to be 15 minutes late to our meeting because I just have to watch the whales. Doesn't really go down too well.
No, but sometimes it does.
Yes.
You know, so but you got to pick your moments.
Exactly.
That's so true. You know, I often say to people, I say, there's three things. Well, the third one, sometimes some things time for me is like, although I must admit, as I'm getting wiser, let me call it wiser with years, I do have slightly less tolerance for people not turning up on time, which, funny enough, when I was growing up, people would actually tell me an hour earlier to be somewhere because time was not on my agenda. But one thing I was never late for was a yacht race or the start of a workshop. There are two things I won't be late for.
I think my two would be the start of a workshop and food.
No, the other one for me would be flying. I like to be early at airports, strangely enough, because I hate rushing. That doesn't mean I've never been late for a flight. I have. And on that particular day, I was very, very grateful, back in the good old days, to have a platinum flyer status. I don't anymore. It wasn't platinum, sorry, it was gold. But anyway, those days are gone. So we have two little questions left. Do the people anticipate possible problems of crisis and plan for possible solutions, or go into protection survival mode? Again, looking at the polarity of cultural diversity.
And often when I think of this one, for me, it very much does fall under orientation to time, because when we're planning, do we plan time into our processes to stop and think? And often when we've had those conversations with leaders on site, and we talk about chunking the job. So you've got this process or procedure that needs to happen, and it takes maybe a few hours, maybe it takes a few days, maybe it takes a few weeks. How often do you take time to stop and think? Because that's when you can plan for crises. You can plan for possible solutions if something isn't working at that junction before the next chunk is finished and it's too late to go back. You can plan for the protection, the survival, whatever way you look at that. I mean, it might be around environmental sustainability. It might be around, making sure nobody gets hurt on the job because there's been a change in the situation around us because the weather's changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for me, we generally don't take enough time to stop and think and put in those breaks and make it an actual break in our processes and policies and say, when you get to this point in the job, stop, assess the current situation. What has worked? What hasn't worked? Are there any concerns before you move into the next stage of this job? If a job happens to go over a full day, make that chunking time after lunch. Do another toolbox talk. Okay, great. We've had a lunch break. Let's make sure we're all focused back on the job. If it goes over a couple of days, how are you making sure that your teams aren't just doing one toolbox talk at the start of the job? Oh, it's the same job. It's the same permit to work. Why do we need to reassess this? Because the situation may have changed. The personnel on the job may have changed. We might have had an equipment failure. So when we're looking at our planning, and for me, the whole prior proper planning prevents poor performance. How are we building in that chunking time to say, now's a good time to take a break and reassess? And then, we're starting refreshed. We've all got our eye on the target. Let's go for it.
Absolutely. I'm currently working with a client on a project, and there's a lot of talk about risk assessments, the formal risk assessment. What there isn't a lot of talking about is dynamic risk assessment. And dynamic risk assessment builds in that chunking of time, that situational awareness, being open to what's going on around us and but we should even build in those stop points, even in the formal risk assessment. Yeah.
That for me would be a game changer for so many jobs.
Absolutely. Now, a few companies probably do it these days because it's been, a conversation we've had for many years. But for the most part, it's still quite amazing how many do not. And again, when we do that, we also then take into consideration the people on the job. We're taking their way of being, if you like, onto the job. Are they more relational, people-oriented versus time-oriented in the job planning process? So for those who are very task and time-oriented, stopping the job might be a challenge. But for those on the same job who are more, is everybody still okay with this? It will really cater. And there'll be others, so there has to be a give and take in both sides of that one. Yeah.
And I love the way you're keeping us back to the polarities in all of this. And it's the polarities in ourselves as well. How do we stretch ourselves as a little elastic band from our comfort point to somebody else's comfort point, and then we can come back to ours?
Yeah, and that's a really key point. It's not about it's not either or. We will have our own preferential way of operating. But there are going to be times when we need to, what will it take us to stretch a little bit the other way towards the other person's way of operating, so that we can have mutual success? And it keeps coming back to, what does mutual success look like? That's safe, that's been, done to the required standards, that meets the costs, the budgets, the whatever element that's required to get that job done properly, and so that all the stakeholders are happy as well. So our final question is, what are some felt needs of the people that their worldview does not address adequately for them?
Dove, for me, this is a very intriguing question. And you've mentioned worldview a couple of times. So before I think either of us address this question, I think it's really important for me to first ask you to tell me a little bit about what exactly do you mean by worldview?
So in intercultural diversity, we look at what we call the three colours of worldview. And they're, by and large, the world is over lots of data that's been collected over the last 20 years. And some people may be very familiar with some of the cultural terms of Hofstadter and a few of the other gurus out there. But we look at the three-colour worldview, and it's made up of three dimensions. One is innocent guilt. So cultures that are around rules, regulations, innocent till proven guilty. Cultures of honour, shame. So the community, the family is all important. And how do we save face, if you like? So not shame those around me, and power, fear, which interestingly enough is still about community. But again, it's about, well, these are cultures where we're kind of brought up thinking about, well, who's important, who's in the pecking order, who do I need to be mindful of? And when I guess many times when you first look at those three, so innocent guilt, honour, shame, power, fear, we probably have some bias and cognitive bias and some stereotypes that automatically will pop up for each of you that's listening. And that's understandable. But when we really look at the three of those, we all have an element of all of that, all of those three dimensions in us. I, for one, if I use myself as an example, have grown up in a predominantly innocent guilt culture, being Australia. So we're very rules-oriented, lots of litigation. We happen to, I was about to be very stereotyping, then I'm going to stop right there. Because we followed another country. All right, but we have governments, we have rules, and in fact, we're a bit of a nanny state. Anyhow.
If you don't tell anybody, I won't.
No, exactly. But for that, it does give us a sense of safety, a sense of security, so there's pros and cons to all of this, in every one of those dimensions. Now, I'm also first generation Australian, so I come from an immigrant family because I come from an Austrian background. So my parents were immigrants and from Austria, which means I have dual nationality, so it means I have different cultural views and norms. So I also have quite a large component of honour, shame in my mix, right? A lot less in the power, fear, and yet under stress, I probably step into the power, fear spheres quadrant dimension. So again, depends where we're sitting on any given day in any given moment. So when we look at another example, as I remember in the early days of doing this work of behavioural safety and change management, essentially around safety, in the early days I used to go. Well, I've done a lot of work in and around Africa, and at the time I was working in West Africa, and I can remember, and I was working for a very innocent guilt type of culture organisation, so very rules-based. So, of course, you think about safety conversations, you think about the safety norms that we were trying to implement. It was coming from a very innocent guilt, predominantly Western culture, which is predominantly an innocent guilt approach. If you think the Americas, the Australasia, the UK or the British Isles, we tend to be very innocent guilt culture. They're everywhere. It's not just in those countries, but, they predominantly are because of their governmental systems as much as anything, their schooling systems, that sort of drives that. So, of course, here's this approach, and yet we're working in an environment that is probably more honour, shame / power, fear in strength rather than innocent guilt in approach, in their worldviews. So when you look at it from that perspective, you start to think, well, how is this going to work? Have we really taken into consideration those other worldviews in how we're trying to encourage them to be safe, to get the work done? Have we taken into consideration? I mean, I didn't know this, think about it then, but I did think back then, and which has took me on quite a journey around how we communicate and the lots of learning since then to now. I did sort of think we're making a lot of assumptions here, or assertions, if you like, and based on what?
Based on me, myself, and I.
Yeah, from an organizational level, but even so. And so the three colors of worldview is a really great starting point and a great assessment to get a good cultural, because you can actually run this as an individual to get a sense of yourself. But where it comes really into its own is when you actually look at the group and you start to map where you are all on the group. And it doesn't mean that you have to, it just means, where do we need to stretch? Where do we need to be mindful and considerate of the differences so that we create that third cultural space? Yeah. So the three colors of worldview is a really fascinating way to view the world. And a lot of these questions that we've been talking about is taken from the 12 dimensions of culture, or intercultural intelligence. And so that's why we keep talking throughout this today about the polarity of the two. So nothing is right or wrong. When we're dealing with humans, it's about how do we learn, how do we get a better understanding of ourselves and the people that are around us? How do we lead better? How do we have conversations that matter and that make a difference? So the more that we can learn about that and our differences, the better chance we have of having a true culture of safety.
And that explanation, especially around the worldviews, really brings back to that initial question, that when things aren't working, it's because people's needs are not being met from their worldview. And again, it's not about people being wrong or difficult or obtuse. It's not making sense to me from the way that my world looks. So bringing it back to that stretching, those polarities. Yeah. And I think the greatest lesson is to be able to say, this is who I am, and I'm okay with that. And this is who you are, and I'm okay with that as well. Even if it doesn't mean that we always meet each other eye to eye, or we don't clash, or we don't have a difference of opinion or way of doing things, as long as we're okay to have that conversation and say, this might not really be working the best way that it possibly could. Let's sit down and have a cup of tea.
Let's figure it out.
Talk about it.
Yeah. Everything starts with a conversation. And from conversation,
and the quality.
Relationships, which builds our culture.
Yeah. And I love, Kaz, because you've often said to me, let's pay attention to the quality of the conversation that we're having. It's not just about having a conversation. And so often, I mean, I know me, I love to just dive into stuff. Then I just get passionate and then I'll just have a conversation, sometimes for the sake of having the conversation. Whereas actually when we want to create meaningful change, it really is around the quality of that conversation and what is the intended outcome for mutual success.
And that's a wrap for today. Thank you for joining us today. It's always lovely to have these conversations that matter. We'll be delighted if you share this podcast and hit the subscribe button on your preferred podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify, etc. Connect with us via our website, www.safetycollaborations.com, where you will find the show notes for today's episode. Email us at hello@safetycollaborations.com. We'd be delighted to hear from you. We are easy to find on LinkedIn. Just look out for either Nuala Gage or Karen Avari and follow our company page, Safety Collaborations. Until next week, stay safe and stay well.